Hey everyone, welcome back for another deep dive.
Always a pleasure to be here.
So today, we're going to be looking at the potential impact of President Trump's
Yeah.
tariffs, specifically focusing on the e-commerce platform Etsy.
Right.
And we have a really great article here from the Motley Fool, published March 14th, 2025.
Yeah, just this week, so
Yeah.
very relevant,
Yeah, very timely. We're seeing
very topical.
Yeah, definitely. And we've been seeing these recent declines in some of the major indexes,
Yeah.
even, with the Nasdaq entering what's called correction territory, which is a significant drop. And a lot of that investor unease seems to be tied to, this potential for economic fallout from these new trade policies. So
Yeah, and I mean, it makes sense when you look at the details of these policies and how they could impact businesses. We're talking about a pretty substantial shift in the trade landscape.
absolutely. And that's what we're going to be, kind of digging into today. So our mission for this deep dive is to really kind of like pull apart this article and look at, what are the potential challenges that these tariffs might present for Etsy,
Okay.
but also, and perhaps even more intriguingly, are there any unexpected opportunities that could actually emerge for them?
Right. Yeah, that's the interesting angle. Like, are there any silver linings to this sort of trade war cloud?
Exactly. Yeah. So let's jump in.
Let's get into it.
Okay. So the Motley Fool starts by kind of laying out the broader picture of these tariffs, right? So
Right.
initially they were applied to imports from some of our major trading partners,
Okay.
China, Canada, Mexico.
Yeah, the big ones?
And the stated aim from the Trump administration, was to address concerns around the flow of illegal drugs,
Yeah.
coming across borders and things like that.
Right. That was the initial justification, at least for those first round of tariffs.
Right. And then it kind of went on from there. So the article details how it's expanded, beyond just that,
Mhm.
with the announcement of tariffs on steel and aluminum imports. And that's pretty much everybody.
Yeah, that's global. At that point, almost every country is subject to those tariffs.
Right. So it's become kind of like a much more comprehensive sort of trade policy than maybe it seemed like at first.
Yeah, definitely widened in scope. And I think that's where some of the economic concerns really start to kick in.
Yeah. Yeah. And so the article talks about how, economists are starting to get a little bit worried because, there's this concern that these tariffs could translate to higher prices, for us, you and
I
me.
mean, for everyday consumers, right? I mean, we're the ones who ultimately end up footing the bill if businesses have to pay more to import goods.
Right. And then that has knock-on effects because
Yeah.
it could affect the Federal Reserve's, planned interest rate cuts.
Yeah. Which they were hoping would stimulate the economy, right? So if inflation goes up because of these tariffs, the Fed might have to hold off on those cuts, which could then slow down economic growth even more.
Right. So it's like a double whammy of higher prices and potentially stagnant interest rates.
Yeah.
Which really could, hamper growth.
Yeah, and that's particularly worrisome for companies that rely on a strong and growing economy to thrive, particularly in sectors like tech and consumer goods.
Right. Which we've seen, reflected in the stock market.
Exactly. Those sectors have taken a hit recently,
Mm-hmm.
and it's likely at least partly due to these tariff concerns.
Yeah. So, keeping in mind that wider economic picture, let's focus on Etsy.
Okay, yeah. Let's zoom in on Etsy specifically.
So the Motley Fool highlights a potential red flag for Etsy, and they called this out specifically.
Okay. Yeah.
And it kind of revolves around how these tariffs could affect, our household budgets.
Yeah. Right, because like we were just talking about, tariffs can lead to higher prices.
Right.
And if things get more expensive, people have less money to spend on non-essentials.
Exactly. And they remind us that tariffs on goods coming from Mexico are set to go into full effect.
Even after that initial delay.
Right.
All right.
Even after that initial delay. And that could lead to even more price increases on everyday items, that we all rely on.
Yeah. It's the things we buy all the time.
Yeah. And they specifically mention Target
Okay.
as an example.
As a retailer, that could be affected.
Yeah, because they source a lot of produce from Mexico.
Right. So if those tariffs hit Mexican produce, Target might have to raise their prices, and that's going to impact shoppers.
Right. So it's like, it's not just,
It's not just hypothetical.
Yeah. It's like you could see it happening already.
Exactly. We're talking about real-world consequences here.
Right. And so I guess, the connection there is that if people are spending more on those basics like groceries, there's obviously going to be less left over for,
For those discretionary purchases.
Right, those non-essential things.
The fun stuff.
Yeah, and that's kind of where Etsy comes in because,
Right, they're not exactly selling necessities.
Right, while they're very appealing, those unique handmade items.
Yeah, the artsy crafty stuff.
Yeah, they often fall into that, discretionary spending category.
For most people, yeah, it's not something you absolutely have to have.
Right, right. And so that's where, this potential problem arises.
Right, because if people are feeling the pinch, they're going to cut back on those non-essential purchases first.
Exactly. And the Motley Fool article even points to some of Etsy's recent financial results
Okay.
As a possible indicator of this.
No, they're already seeing some signs of this sensitivity.
Yeah, well, so, they talk about how Etsy sales outside the U.S., what they call their gross merchandise sales, or GMS.
Yeah, it's basically the total value of everything sold on their platform.
Right, so their non-U.S. GMS hasn't been performing as well as their U.S. sales.
Interesting.
And the company itself has attributed that to tougher economic conditions in a lot of those international markets.
That makes sense. If people are struggling financially in other countries, they're probably cutting back on their Etsy purchases.
Right. And then it's not just, happening overseas.
Okay.
The article also reminds us that back here in the States, the rising inflation that we saw starting back in 2022 has already created some headwinds for Etsy, and they saw a decline in their annual GMS. And that's kind of continued through 2024.
So they're already feeling the pressure from inflation even before these new tariffs come into play.
Right, right. So it's like, this fresh wave of potential price increases, on top of everything else.
But really exacerbate the problem.
Right, really amplify that existing pressure.
Definitely a cause for concern.
Yeah. So that's kind of like the red flag,
Yeah.
the potential negative side of things.
Okay, so where's the green flag? Where's the potential upside?
Okay, so this is where it gets interesting.
I'm intrigued.
The Motley Fool, they present this more optimistic outlook.
Okay.
They call it a potential green flag for Etsy.
Interesting.
And this stems from, ironically, the very same tariffs.
Okay, so how do tariffs end up being a good thing for Etsy?
Right, so it all kind of centers around this current situation with low-value imports from China.
Okay, so like small packages, cheap goods.
Right. Yeah. So right now, goods coming from China with a value of under $800.
Okay.
They're entering the U.S. without being subject to tariffs.
Wait, really? So they're exempt?
Yeah. And apparently it's because, the sheer volume of these small packages makes it hard to efficiently collect duties.
That makes sense. It would be a logistical nightmare to try and track and tax every single one of those packages.
Right, right. But here's the thing.
Okay.
The Trump administration has kind of hinted that this might not be permanent.
Oh.
They've suggested that once they have more streamlined systems in place, to handle the collection of these tariffs on the smaller shipments, this exemption could be lifted.
Oh, wow. So that would be a huge change.
Yeah, and that's where things could really get interesting for Etsy.
Okay, because
suddenly all those, cheaper alternatives that a lot of consumers have been gravitating towards.
Especially those coming from China.
Right, especially from China. Yeah, those could become significantly more expensive.
Okay, I'm starting to see the upside here.
Right. It could essentially level the playing field,
Yep.
Potentially making Etsy's more unique and often, higher priced offerings.
More competitive.
More competitive, exactly.
So instead of being drawn to those cheaper imports, people might be more willing to pay a bit more for something special and unique from Etsy.
Right. And the Motley Fool points out, one of the challenges that Etsy has faced recently is competition from these lower price goods, particularly as people have become, so focused on
getting the best deal.
Yeah, the best deal and fast shipping.
Right. Instant gratification is a big factor these days.
Yeah. So if tariffs make those alternatives, from overseas pricier, Etsy might actually see some of that competitive pressure ease up a bit.
Okay, that's a really interesting point. So it's not just about Etsy's prices, it's about how their prices compare to the competition.
Exactly, yeah. And then here's another key factor that the article highlights that works in Etsy's favor.
Okay.
The vast majority of their sellers actually source their materials domestically.
Wow. So they're not reliant on imports as much.
Right. They say typically within about 60 miles of their operations.
That's impressive, really localized supply chains.
Yeah, so that means the direct impact of these tariffs on the cost of the raw materials that these sellers are using to create their goods should be relatively minimal.
So while other retailers are scrambling to adjust to higher import costs, Etsy's sellers are kind of insulated from that because they're sourcing locally.
Right, exactly. So, while a lot of other businesses are seeing their costs go up because of the tariffs,
Hmm.
Etsy's sellers are, with their local sourcing focus,
Yeah.
they're somewhat shielded from that.
That's a significant advantage,
Right.
especially in this kind of uncertain trade environment.
Yeah, and the article even quotes Etsy's CEO, Joshua Silverman,
Okay.
and he suggests that the company could potentially even be a net beneficiary
Wow.
of tariffs that are specifically targeting China, at least in the short term.
That's a pretty bold statement.
Yeah, he seems pretty confident.
Seems like they've really thought this through and they see a genuine opportunity here.
Right, right. And, it kind of underscores this potential shift in the dynamics of the market.
Definitely. It's not just about the direct impact of tariffs on Etsy's goods. It's about how those tariffs reshape the entire competitive landscape.
Exactly. Yeah. So, to be fair, the Motley Fool article does a good job of kind of presenting this balanced perspective,
Right.
by also acknowledging some of the challenges that Etsy has faced.
Okay.
And they point out, the significant growth that they saw during the pandemic.
Oh, yeah. Everybody was stuck at home shopping online.
Right.
Right.
And then, some normalization after that.
Sure. Which makes sense. That kind of growth wasn't sustainable forever.
Right. But, they have seen more recent declines in their GMS, fewer active buyers,
Okay.
and a decrease in the number of habitual buyers.
People who buy regularly. Yeah.
Yeah. And,
So they're facing challenges, but they're not just sitting back and accepting it.
right. So they are taking steps. And the article mentions, how they're working to improve product discovery.
Okay. How easy it is for people to find what they're looking for.
Right. Through their search algorithm.
That's crucial, especially with so much competition online.
Yeah. And they're apparently giving more weight to things like customer reviews and shipping speed in their search rankings.
Oh, that's smart. So they're prioritizing quality and reliability.
Right. So, trying to make it easier for buyers to find,
Good stuff.
yeah, the high quality,
Get it quickly.
yeah, the well-reviewed items that ship reliably.
Right. Because in the end, it's all about customer satisfaction and encouraging those repeat purchases.
Right, exactly. And the article emphasizes that despite these challenges, Etsy has a core strength in their business model.
What is it?
They say it's capital light.
Okay.
And it generates really strong free cash flow.
That's always a good sign.
Yeah. And they mentioned that in the most recent quarter, it was around 90% of their adjusted EBITDA.
90%. Wow. That's impressive.
Yeah.
So that's a measure of their profitability before certain expenses, and 90% free cash flow means they have a lot of financial flexibility.
Right. And that gives them, a lot of room to weather these economic uncertainties.
Yeah, they can invest in their platform. They can potentially absorb any dips in consumer spending. It gives them options.
Yeah. Right. So when you kind of put it all together, the Motley Fool article concludes that even with this, kind of unpredictable landscape created by these tariffs, Etsy's stock, which is currently trading at around 9 times their projected future earnings, looks like it could be a potentially attractive investment.
That's a pretty significant takeaway.
Yeah, it's not a guarantee, obviously, but...
Sure, of course not. Investing always has risks.
Right, right. But, it's something to consider.
Definitely. It seems like they've got some strong fundamentals working in their favor.
Yeah, so I guess to kind of wrap up, our deep dive here, the central takeaway seems to be that these tariffs, they're creating a really complex situation.
Definitely not a simple black and white situation.
No, not at all. And, Etsy is right in the middle of it.
Right on the front lines.
Yeah. On one hand, there's this very real risk that, these increased prices
On essential goods, yeah.
right, could really squeeze consumer budgets and reduce their appetite for,
Those fun Etsy purchases.
yeah, for those discretionary items.
Right.
But then on the other hand, there's this real potential for decreased competition.
Especially from those Chinese sellers.
Right, if those low-value import exemptions are lifted.
Yeah, and those tariffs actually start hitting those cheaper goods.
Right, and that could actually, be a good thing for Etsy.
It could really shake things up and give Etsy a competitive edge.
Right, and I think, that kind of brings us to this final thought for all of our listeners out there.
Okay, hit us with it.
Considering Etsy's fundamental nature as a platform for these unique, often handmade goods, how might the perceived value of those items shift
That's a great question.
in a potentially higher-priced environment?
So if everything becomes more expensive, do people start valuing those handmade goods even more?
Right, or do they just become, even more laser focused on finding the absolute cheapest option.
No matter what, right?
Right. Will we see this greater appreciation for locally sourced, handcrafted items?
Because they represent something different, something special.
Right? Or will it just be a race to the bottom?
That's really interesting to think about. How will consumer behavior adapt to these economic shifts?
Yeah, it's a fascinating thing to consider.
And it'll be interesting to see how Etsy navigates these uncharted waters.
Absolutely. So that's something for all of you to kind of ponder
Yeah, chew on that for a while.
as we watch how these economic conditions and the dynamics of the e-commerce market continue to evolve.
Absolutely. A lot to keep an eye on.
Thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me.